The greatest disservice that the African presidents have done to the African people is to let the African resources to continue to go out there and grease the economies of Western Europe, to grease the economies of Australia, to go out there to continue to grease the economy of Canada, to go out there and grease the economy of the United States, while the African people continue to wander in poverty, in squalor, when they very well know what they are supposed to do. The greatest disservice they have done to the African people is to continue to live in luxury while the African people are suffering. The greatest disservice today's African leaders have done to the African people is to sell our resources and give them out freely, and we don't see the money that comes from them. The greatest disservice these African presidents have done to our people is to drive convoys and live like semi-gods, like demigods and semi-gods and small gods, while our people live like devils in slums. The greatest disservice the African presidents have done to the African people is to very well know that the system they are perpetrating and they are protecting is not delivering anything to the African people. But they are not telling the African people that the system we are perpetrating, it will not deliver the continent even in the next 1,000 years. The greatest disservice these African presidents, whether they are in opposition or in government, they have done to the African people is to continue to protect a wicked and evil system which was brought by the Europeans, and refuse to tell the African people the truth that this system is rotten and it has failed even for the people who brought it here. We can talk of Spain, we can talk of Portugal, we can talk of Italy, we can talk of Greece, we can talk of Britain, we can talk of America. All over, this system is failing. It is a failure. And that is a disservice, a great disservice to the African people. One of the greatest disservice these African presidents have done to the African people is not to think, to resign themselves to laziness and stop thinking as if their brains have been limited. But we, the next generation of youth, we have come up and realized that this system, it will not do anything for us. It will not provide the goods even in the next 2,000, 1,000, 2,000 years. It will not. One of the greatest disservice these African presidents have done to the African people is not to face up to the truth and tell the African people that electing does not necessarily produce good leaders. Electing leaders, it does not mean that we are going to produce the goods. The greatest disservice the current African leaders they have done to the African people is not to tell them that we have masters in Europe, that they have their masters in Europe who are telling them what to do in Africa. The greatest disservice these African leaders have done to the African people is to continue to let the economies of Africa to be run by Europeans and run by the direction of the Europeans, and that it is Europeans who are advising them in the central banks and all kind of systems. The greatest disservice these African presidents they have done to the African people is to know the enemy of the African people and not tell the African people who the enemy is. These African leaders, the greatest disservice they have done to the African people is to continue to show up and keep our wealth, which is given to them, which is bribed by them, by the whites, and given to these African leaders. They continue to keep that wealth in European capitals while the African people continue to live in poverty. The greatest disservice these African leaders have done to the African people is for them to continue to fly in bulletproof cars and in multi-million-dollar private jets around the world, and to send their children across to foreign lands to study, while the African people continue to study in free education schools, where even the education is very bad and there is no seats, and children study under trees. These people have done a great disservice to the African continent, and it is time for the African people themselves. It is time for the African masses themselves to stand up and destroy, I repeat, and destroy this system of electing and regret. It is time for the African people to stand up and destroy a system that has impoverished us for the last 60 years while other nations are developing in less than 60 years. It is time for the African people to stand up and destroy this system which is stealing our African resources to develop European capitals, American capitals, Canada, Australia, while the African people continue to wander in poverty. It is time for the African people to rise up and destroy this system which these African leaders are protecting, and it is not benefiting the African people. It is time for the African people to rise up, especially the youth, and destroy this system which is robbing Africans more than $100 billion every year, more than $100 billion every year. And this man is going to Western Europe, to America, Canada, and Australia, and these capitals are stealing the resources and the money which is supposed to build infrastructure in Africa. It is time for the African people to start questioning this evil system that was brought by the whites. It is time for the African people to start boycotting European products that are coming on the African continent, whether it be it France, whether it be it America, whether it be it any European country that are stealing our resources. We know them. It is time for the African people to boycott the European financial institutions which are on the African continent and robbing the African people. It is time to boycott those financial institutions. We know them. We know those institutions. And if you need, I can mention them and break them down for you. These are the institutions which are stealing the African resources and the African money and sending it to Europe and sending it to America, sending it to Canada, sending it to Australia, and leaving Africa impoverished. It is time for the African people to confront who the enemy is. It is time for the African people to confront who the enemy of Africa is, and that is Europe, that is America, that is Canada, that is Australia. It is time to confront the enemy of Africa. It is time to confront the enemy who's empowering these African leaders so that they can continue to steal our resources from Africa while Africa suffers and there is no infrastructure, there is no electricity, there is no water. It is time for the African people to rise up all together and attack the enemy who is stealing from Africa. It is time for the African people to realize who has been dividing the continent and saying this African is better, this country is better, and the other one is not doing better. It is time for the African people to rise up and realize that the divide and conquer tactics, they cannot work again. It is time for the African people to come out and speak and say we have realized White man, we have realized your tactics of your divide and conquer that you have been spreading on the African continent. It is time for the African people to rise up and unite Africa and rebuild it urgently within a period of less than 40 years. It is time for the African people. It is time for Africa to unite, and Africa must unite now.